Thanks everyone. I am today going to talk about a relatively new NFDAP grant that I've been working on with my co-Is who are listed here, characterizing boulders on asteroid Bennu. So the OSIRIS-REx mission essentially confirmed the fact that Bennu is a rubble pile asteroid, which means that it is composed of basically entirely of boulders and rock fragments down to from about 100 meters diameter down to the submicroscopic size range, as far as we know. And from preliminary investigations during the OSIRIS-REx mission, we found that there are at least two populations of boulders with distinct properties. And from this histogram, you can see that they are distinguishable based on their reflectance, where there's if you can see my cursor, there is a population of boulders about average reflectance or darker than average Bennu, and a second population of brighter boulders. I mean, brighter being a relative term, it's like 5.5% versus about 4 or 4.5% reflectance. So it's all still very dark. But we call these the dark boulders and the bright boulders. And the dark boulders are also distinct morphologically. They have a rough clastic texture. From the thermophysical data, they have low thermal inertia, low strength, low density, whereas the bright boulders texturally are very smooth, very angular. They also have higher thermal inertia, higher tensile strength, and higher density. Additionally, a subset of these bright boulders appear to have spectral evidence supporting the presence of carbonates exposed in veins or bright spots. So it seems that there are at least two populations of boulders on Bennu. But from an initial analysis of boulder morphology, we find that maybe there's more like 4 populations of boulders with distinct morphologic properties. So we, in an investigation, we talked about this at LPSC this year, we named these 4 groups type A, B, C, and D. Type A is very rugged, it has visible clasts and layers. Type B is a little bit smoother, but still fairly rugged and has intersecting superficial polygonal fractures. Type C is distinctly smooth and angular, has lots of fractures and no clasts. And type D is still fairly smooth, but a bit rougher and has these distinct bright spots. And this plot on the bottom of the slide is showing diameter versus albedo. And we find that all of Bennu's largest boulders, so everything over 15 meters in diameter, are either type A or type B boulders, and they have low to average albedo. And so that doesn't include any of the boulders from that second population, the bright boulders. So we looked separately at the largest bright boulders, and those are all type C or type D. And so we have these 4 different morphologies with 2 different ranges of reflectance, but these 2 groups on the plot don't intersect at all. So we really need more data to fully understand the diversity and characteristics of boulders on Bennu. And so that inspired this NFDAP grant that we proposed to look at the full diversity or a fuller diversity of boulders on Bennu, which was motivated by several questions. So how many separate populations of boulders are there on Bennu? How do they vary in morphology, albedo, spectral and thermophysical properties? And thinking forward, not just for us, but for the rest of the Bennu community, what are the most useful data sets single or plural, to distinguish between these boulder populations? And what do all of these populations imply about the parent body itself, or bodies plural? Maybe there have been more than one parent body. And so we wanted to look at the regions on Bennu that have the highest possible resolution data in all of our data sets. So these are the regions covered by the recon phase of the mission, which are outlined in these colored circles here. And so we selected a bunch of regions of interest, ROI, and mapped all the boulders larger than 2 meters in diameter. And now we're currently investigating all of these boulders with essentially all of the major data sets from the OSIRIS-REx mission. But it's still in the early days. So I'm just going to focus on Nightingale, where we have about 400 boulders. And I'm just going to talk about my part of this analysis so far, which is the albedo and morphology analysis. So for the morphologic analysis, our approach was to assess various aspects of morphology and to assign codes for the properties of each boulder, including angularity, texture, the presence or absence of clasts, layers, and bright spots. And so we assigned one code for each of these 5 categories to each boulder. And we also separately assigned a classification group, this type A, B, C, or D, to each boulder. But we also wanted to take more of a statistical approach to classifying these boulders. So we implemented an automated clustering using this program called K-modes algorithm. This is a type of unsupervised machine learning clustering algorithm, specifically for categorical data as opposed to numerical data. So you'll put in these lettered codes, and K-modes will determine the optimal number of clusters and members of each cluster. So when we ran this clustering analysis, the results selected 4 groups that broadly contain a majority of each of our type A, B, C, and D classes. So the preliminary results from our manual and our K-modes clustering are consistent with 4 groups that are distinct in their morphologic properties, which is nice because that's consistent. And so that's encouraging so far. And then the last part of this first stage of our analysis is to compare the morphologic criteria to albedo data from the PolyCam instrument, because our initial analysis of the larger boulders suggested that the type A and B boulders are larger and darker quite distinctly compared to the C and D boulders. So at least for this initial part of the analysis, we find that the type A boulders are the most abundant, the largest. You can see in the plot of diameter versus albedo. But all 4 morphologic types are also present at the smallest sizes. Additionally, while the type A and B boulders are average to dark in PolyCam albedo, and while the type C and D boulders are brighter, there's much more overlap in our data set than was indicated by our previous results. So really, we need to finish this albedo analysis in Nightingale and then continue our investigation to see how morphology and albedo correlate to each other and also to all of our other data sets. But so far, things are looking consistent and pretty interesting so far. So our next steps, we have a bunch of work that's currently ongoing. So we're also currently calculating the surface roughness of every boulder using the OLA, the laser altimeter data. And once that analysis and the albedo analysis is complete, we'll incorporate those data sets into our clustering algorithm with the morphologic data, and using an algorithm called K-prototypes, which can take numerical and categorical data. We're going to redo the entire clustering to see if is it still 4 groups, or maybe it's 2 groups, or maybe it's some totally different clustering is optimal for all of the data. And then once that's complete, we will then move on to the spectral and thermophysical analysis portion of the project, because that requires the boulders to already have been classified. So this is really just a progress report. Stay tuned for lots of more results and some hopefully good insights into Bennu's boulders and the parent body. So I'd like to thank my co-Is and acknowledge our funding source of NASA and FDAP, and thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. Bennu's Boulders sounds like a rock group. Do we have any quick questions? This is see, if not, it's time to move on to the next one. I'm Paul Blasi, Space Initiatives, and co-chairing with Kevin Walsh.
There is a question.
Oh, sorry.
In the main room.
Yes, sir.
Yes, hello. I had a question about the K-modes and the K-prototypes. So with typical categorization and machine learning, when using just kind of discrete labels, there's an implicit bias where A is less than B because in a just implicit categorical way, it has a lesser numerical value in a computer model. How do these kind of categorizations take that into account to make sure that there isn't this kind of implicit bias occurring when categorizing these boulders?
Oh, that's a cool question. Yeah. So the way that the K-modes algorithm works is instead of like a K-means clustering where you're actually calculating a numeric mean and minimizing that, you're finding the mode of the data. So you're looking for the most number of recurring code, like letters. So instead of saying like minimize the difference in the numbers, it's calculating the differences in your data set. So one data set will be AATSCA, and another one will be some slight different combination of those codes. And so you want to have the codes be the most similar to each other. So we're not really quantifying the letters in any way. It's just finding the similarities and pattern matching, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for a short question.
Sure. Darulamain Planetary Science Institute, have you compared your boulder textures on Bennu with what they see on Ryugu? And how they compare and contrast?
Excellent question. So that's not part of this project itself, but we have done that just as part of the broader, OSIRIS-REx analysis. And there are very interesting similarities. There are quite similar matches to basically all of the boulder types. But we're still figuring out the relationships between the different boulder types on Bennu, and we're seeing some contacts that are not necessarily present between the different boulder morphologies that we're seeing on Ryugu. So I really would like to have a dedicated project to that, because right now there's some really interesting comparisons and similarities between the two.
Awesome.
Thanks, Deborah.